features of banding together, killing, and dismembering, as expressed in the deed of the Titans, very clearly recall the totem sacrifice described by St. Nilus, as also many other myths of antiquity, for example, the death of Orpheus himself, we are nevertheless disturbed here by the variation according to which a youthful god was murdered. In the Christian myth, man's original sin is undoubtedly offense against God the Father, and if Christ redeems mankind from the weight of original sin by sacrificing his own life, he forces us to the conclusion that this sin was murder. According to the law of retaliation, which is deeply rooted in human feeling, a murder can be atoned only by the sacrifice of another life. The self-sacrifice points to a blood guilt. And if this sacrifice of one's own life brings about a reconciliation with God the Father, then the crime which must be expiated can only have been the murder of the Father. Thus in the Christian doctrine, mankind most unreservedly acknowledges the guilty deed of primordial times, because it now has found the most complete expiation for this deed in the sacrificial death of the Son. The reconciliation with the Father is the more thorough because simultaneously with this sacrifice there follows the complete renunciation of woman, for whose sake mankind rebelled against the Father. But now also the psychological fatality of ambivalence demands its rights. In the same deed which offers the greatest possible expiation to the Father, the Son also attains the goal of his wishes against the Father. He becomes a god himself, beside, or rather in place of, his Father. The religion of the Son succeeds the religion of the Father. As a sign of this substitution, the old totem feast is revived again in the form of communion, in which the band of brothers now eats the flesh and blood of the Son, and no longer that of the Father, the sons thereby identifying themselves with him and becoming wholly themselves. Thus through the ages we see the identity of the totem feast with the animal sacrifice, the theanthropic human sacrifice, and the Christian Eucharist. And in all these solemn occasions we recognize the after effects of that crime which so oppressed men, but of which they must have been so proud. At bottom, however, the Christian communion is a new setting aside of the Father, a repetition of the crime that must be expiated. We see how well justified is Fraser's dictum that the Christian communion has absorbed within itself a sacrament which is doubtless far older than Christianity. Section 7. A process like the removal of the primal father by the band of brothers must have left ineradicable traces in the history of mankind, and must have expressed itself the more frequently in numerous substitutive formations the less it itself was to be remembered. I am avoiding the temptation of pointing out these traces in mythology where they are not hard to find, and am turning to another field in following a hint of S. Reinach in his suggestive treatment of the death of Orpheus. There is a situation in the history of Greek art which is strikingly familiar even if profoundly divergent to the scene of a totem feast discovered by Robertson Smith. It is the situation of the oldest Greek tragedy. A group of persons, all of the same name and dressed in the same way, surround a single figure upon whose words and actions they are dependent, to represent the chorus and the original single impersonator of the hero. Later developments created a second and a third actor in order to represent opponents in playing, and offshoots of the hero, but the character of the hero as well as his relation to the chorus remains unchanged. The hero of the tragedy had to suffer. This is today still the essential content of a tragedy. He had taken upon himself the so-called tragic guilt, which is not always easy to explain. It is often not a guilt in the ordinary sense. Almost always it consisted of a rebellion against a divine or human authority, and the chorus accompanied the hero with their sympathies, trying to restrain and warn him, and lamented his fate after he had met with what was considered fitting punishment for his daring attempt. But why did the hero of the tragedy have to suffer, and what was the meaning of his tragic guilt? We will cut short the discussion by a prompt answer. He had to suffer because he was the primal father. The hero of that primordial tragedy, the repetition of which here serves a certain tendency, and the tragic guilt is the guilt which he had to take upon himself in order to free the chorus of theirs. The scene upon the stage came into being through purposive distortion of the historical scene, or, one is tempted to say, it was the result of refined hypocrisy. Actually, in the old situation, it was the members of the chorus themselves who had caused the suffering of the hero. Here, on the other hand, they exhaust themselves in sympathy and regret, and the hero himself is to blame for his suffering. The crime foisted upon him, namely, presumption and rebellion against a great authority, is the same as that which in the past oppressed the colleagues of the chorus, namely, the band of brothers. Thus the tragic hero, though still against his will, is made the redeemer of the chorus. When one bears in mind the suffering of the divine goat Dionysus in the performance of the Greek tragedy and the lament of the retinue of goats who identified themselves with him, one can easily understand how the almost extinct drama was reviewed in the Middle Ages in the Passion of Christ. In closing this study, which has been carried out in extremely condensed form, I want to state the conclusion that the beginnings of religion, ethics, society, and art meet in the Oedipus complex. This is in entire accord with the findings of psychoanalysis, namely that the nucleus of all neuroses, as far as our present knowledge of them goes, is the Oedipus complex. It comes as a great surprise to me that these problems of racial psychology can also be solved through a single concrete instance, such as the relation to the father. Perhaps another psychological problem must be included here. We have so frequently had occasion to show the ambivalence of emotions in its real sense, that is to say, the coincidence of love and hate towards the same object, at the root of important cultural formations. We know nothing about the origin of this ambivalence. It may be assumed to be a fundamental phenomenon of our emotional life, but the other possibility seems to me also worthy of consideration, that ambivalence, originally foreign to our emotional life, was acquired by mankind from the father complex, where psychoanalytic investigation of the individual today still reveals the strongest expression of it. Before closing, we must take into account that the remarkable convergence reached in these illustrations, pointing to a single inclusive relation, ought not to blind us to the uncertainties of our assumptions and to the difficulties of our conclusions. Of these difficulties I will point out only two, which must have forced themselves upon many readers. In the first place, it can hardly have escaped anyone that we base everything upon the assumption of a psyche of the mass, in which psychic processes occur as in the psychic life of the individual. Moreover, we let the sense of guilt for a deed survive for thousands of years, remaining effective in generations which could not have known anything of this deed. We allow an emotional process, such as might have arisen among generations of sons that had been ill-treated by their fathers, to continue to new generations which had escaped such treatment by the very removal of the father. These seem indeed to be weighty objections, and any other explanation which can avoid such assumptions would seem to merit preference. But further consideration shows that we ourselves do not have to carry the whole responsibility for such daring. Without the assumption of a mass psyche, or a continuity of the emotional life of mankind, which permits us to disregard the interruptions of psychic acts through the transgression of individuals, social psychology could not exist at all. If psychic processes of one generation did not continue in the next, if each had to acquire its attitude towards life afresh, there would be no progress in this field and almost no development. We are now confronted by two new questions. How much can be attributed to this psychic continuity within the series of generations, and what ways and means does a generation use to transfer its psychic states to the next generation? I do not claim that these problems have been sufficiently explained